Some people who grew up in the 1970s don't chase status. They don't measure themselves by titles, recognition, or visible success, not because they rejected ambition, but because status never felt central to survival. They learned early that respect was quiet, temporary, and often unrelated to effort. So they stopped organizing their lives around being seen. In the 1970s, status was not something constantly performed. There were no digital platforms demanding visibility, no endless comparisons unfolding in real time. Achievement existed, but it was not staged. Most people lived close to necessity, where work was meant to sustain life rather than signal identity. Stability mattered more than distinction. Children growing up in that environment absorbed this atmosphere without being taught directly. They saw adults define themselves through function rather than image. A person was valued for what they could maintain, a household, a routine, a responsibility, not for how impressively they presented themselves. Status existed, but it was muted, situational, and rarely celebrated. Because there were fewer incentives to curate the self, identity developed quietly. You were known locally, not broadcast publicly. Reputation travelled slowly and rarely expanded beyond immediate circles. This limited the emotional weight of status. It was something you occupied temporarily, not something you chased endlessly. For many, this created an early separation between self-worth and visibility. Being competent felt sufficient. Being admired felt optional. Children learned that life continued whether or not anyone was watching. This lesson settled deeply, shaping an internal orientation where usefulness outweighed recognition and adequacy mattered more than distinction. Many people raised in the 1970s witnessed a quiet contradiction early in life. Adults worked long hours, fulfilled obligations, and carried responsibility without receiving praise. Effort was expected. Reliability was assumed. Recognition, when it appeared, was brief and easily withdrawn. This environment weakened the psychological bond between effort and external reward. Children learned that doing things well did not necessarily lead to approval. Competence was not a path to attention, it was simply the baseline. As a result, motivation shifted inward. Work was done because it needed to be done, not because it would be noticed. Over time, this shaped how reward was perceived. External validation felt unreliable and emotionally unstable. Depending on it, seemed risky. If recognition could vanish without warning, it made little sense to organize one's identity around it. Status built on acknowledgement appeared fragile. Instead, many learned to regulate satisfaction privately. Finishing a task, keeping something functional, or meeting a responsibility became its own reward. Approval was pleasant, but unnecessary. This did not create pride in obscurity. It created emotional self-sufficiency. By adulthood, status no longer felt like a reliable outcome of effort. It felt incidental. What mattered was continuity, the quiet assurance that life worked, even without applause. In environments where praise was limited, children learned to orient themselves inward. Approval was not something they could count on, so it gradually lost its central role in emotional regulation. Instead of asking, "Am I being noticed?" the question became, "Is this enough to function?" This did not produce strong confidence or bold self-belief. It produced something quieter, emotional independence from evaluation. When recognition was rare, the absence of it stopped feeling like a failure. Silence became normal rather than alarming. Many learned to interpret quiet as neutrality, not rejection. As a result, approval became optional rather than motivating. Praise could be appreciated, but it did not define worth. Without constant feedback, people learned to measure themselves by internal thresholds: completion, responsibility, stability. These internal markers felt more reliable than external judgment. Over time, this shaped an internal sense of adequacy. Worth was something you carried privately, not something negotiated publicly. Being unseen did not automatically signal inadequacy. It simply meant life was continuing as expected. This internal regulation reduced emotional volatility. Fewer highs from praise meant fewer crashes from absence. Status, built on visibility, lost its emotional leverage. What remained was a steady, self-contained sense of sufficiency. For many people raised in the 70s, safety was associated with predictability rather than prominence. Being noticed often meant being examined. Examination invited judgment. Judgment carried consequences, Remaining low profile felt not passive but prudent. Visibility brought pressure, attention brought expectation. With expectation came the risk of failure being seen. In such environments, standing out was not automatically rewarding. It was potentially destabilizing. Stability was preserved by blending in. This shaped a preference for continuity over recognition. A quiet life felt manageable. A visible one felt exposed. Status required maintenance, explanation, and constant reinforcement. Stability required consistency and restraint. Over time, this created a psychological link between low visibility and emotional balance. Staying unremarkable reduced anxiety. Avoiding the spotlight preserved control. People learned to regulate risk by limiting exposure. As adults, many still choose environments where expectations are clear and manageable. They may avoid roles that demand constant performance, not out of fear, but out of preference. For them, equilibrium matters more than distinction. In the 1970s, comparison existed, but it was limited. There were fewer signals constantly ranking people against one another. You did not wake up each day confronted with curated versions of other lives. Without continuous reference points, comparison remained occasional rather than habitual. Because comparison was infrequent, status anxiety had little room to grow. People were aware of differences, but they were not surrounded by reminders of them. Success was local and often invisible beyond immediate circles. This reduced the emotional urgency to measure oneself against others. Children growing up in this environment learned to aim for adequacy rather than superiority. Being enough felt sufficient. There was little cultural pressure to be exceptional. Progress meant stability, not escalation. Over time, this shaped a quiet indifference toward ranking. Knowing where one stood was less important than knowing whether life functioned. Comparison felt informational, not evaluative. It did not define worth. As adults, many from this background still struggle to understand intense status competition. Constant comparison feels unnecessary, even exhausting. They do not resist it consciously. It simply does not register as meaningful. Their reference point remains internal, grounded in sufficiency rather than advantage. Identity in the 1970s was rooted in roles rather than performance. You were defined by what you did consistently, not by how you presented it. Being a worker, a parent, or a neighbour carried meaning because these roles sustained everyday life. There was little expectation to turn identity into display. Self-expression existed, but it was not tied to constant validation. Reliability mattered more than visibility. Showing up mattered more than standing out. As a result, self-worth developed around function. People evaluated themselves by whether they fulfilled obligations, not whether they attracted attention. Character was practical. It was measured in continuity and trust rather than admiration. This made status feel secondary. Titles and recognition did not redefine identity. They were additions, not foundations. When removed, the self remained intact. In adulthood, this often appears as indifference to symbolic reward. These individuals are not disengaged from life. They are anchored to usefulness. What impresses others rarely alters how they see themselves. As adults, many people who grew up in the 1970s operate with the internal stopping points. They work until something functions, stabilizes, or becomes sufficient, and then they pause. Their motivation is not endless accumulation, but resolution. This can be misunderstood as lack of drive. In reality, their drive is practical rather than symbolic. They are energized by usefulness, not by status markers. Once a task no longer improves stability, additional effort feels unnecessary. Titles often feel abstract to them. Prestige feels distant, disconnected from daily life. What feels real is whether something works, whether it lasts, whether it reduces future risk. Motivation is anchored in function. Because external reward was never the main regulator, symbolic recognition rarely changes behavior. Praise may be appreciated, but it does not accelerate effort. Criticism may be noted, but it does not destabilize identity. This creates a calm, contained form of motivation. It is steady, not performative. These individuals are not chasing visibility. They are managing life according to internal thresholds of adequacy, shaped long before status became currency. As culture shifted in later decades, visibility gained power. Status became increasingly performative. Achievement was no longer enough, it had to be seen. Identity became something to display, measure, and market. Those who did not adapt to this shift were often misinterpreted. Their restraint was mistaken for disengagement. Their quiet competence was read as lack of ambition. Their refusal to self-promote was seen as underperformance. In professional environments, signaling became necessary for advancement. Silence was easily overlooked. Work without visibility carried less weight. This created friction for those operating under older value systems. They were not resisting the system out of principle. They simply did not experience status as motivating. Performing identity felt unnatural, even unnecessary. This mismatch often led to stalled trajectories, not because of incapacity, but because effort was not translated into signal. Their values had not changed. The environment had. Not caring about status often reduces anxiety. Life feels quieter when comparison and visibility lose importance. However, this indifference also carries a cost. Many opportunities are distributed to instead not only through competence, but through signaling. Recognition frequently requires self-presentation. Skills must be displayed to be acknowledged. Silence, even when grounded in capability, is easy to overlook. In systems built on visibility, invisibility becomes a barrier. As a result, many individuals remained stable yet unrecognized. They performed well, maintained consistency, and avoided failure, but did not advance. This outcome rarely felt unfair, it felt predictable. Because they never expected effort to guarantee recognition, the absence of advancement did not trigger resentment. Instead, it confirmed early assumptions: status is unreliable, attention is temporary, and outcomes are uneven. This acceptance brought emotional steadiness, but also limited leverage. Without participation in the status economy, influence remained local. Security existed, but expansion did not. The cost was not emotional collapse. It was quiet containment, a life that functioned well, yet remained unseen by systems that reward display. Not caring about status is not a moral accomplishment. It is often a developmental outcome shaped by environment rather than intention. For many, indifference was learned before alternatives existed. These individuals are not above ambition. They were raised in contexts where status carried little practical value. Survival depended on function, not recognition. That lesson lingered. Understanding this reframes the narrative. Indifference to status does not mean virtue or deficiency. It reflects adaptation. A system shaped their priorities long before status became central. This awareness creates choice. One can engage with status strategically without being ruled by it. Or one can remain detached without self-judgment. Status, once peripheral, does not need to dominate life. But disengagement works best when conscious, not inherited. Clarity replaces confusion. Agency replaces assumption.